Archaeology has an inexplicable fascination, doesn't it? The idea of finding traces of the past, unearthing long-forgotten secrets, and finally unlocking the mysteries of ancient civilization is what drives so many of us. But what would happen if these secrets were dangerous? If, instead of just revealing the past, they brought to light something that should never be discovered? This is a story that I have not found in books or scientific articles. What I'm about to tell you is not common academic knowledge. It's something I experienced and it changed my life forever. My name is Aaron Swan, and I am a historian specializing in ancient civilization. Throughout my career, I have explored many of the world's most fascinating archaeological sites. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I experienced in the heart of the ancient city of Chichen Itza, Mexico. You've heard of the Mayan pyramids, right? Those imposing monuments, symbols of a lost civilization. For many, they are just majestic structures that hark back to a glorious past. But my team and I discovered something inside that made us rethink everything we thought we knew. And after everything that has happened, I can assure you, the past is much more dangerous than you can imagine. It all started with a seemingly harmless invitation. The National Institute of Anthropology and History of Mexico asked us to participate in a special project. The proposal was intriguing. Investigate an underground chamber recently discovered in the main pyramid of Chichen Itza. Until then, everything seemed exciting. I was accompanied by Sienna Reeves, my girlfriend and one of the most brilliant epigraphists I've ever met. The idea of unveiling ancient inscriptions and, who knows, revealing new aspects of Mayan culture filled us with enthusiasm. But there was something in that invitation that we were not told. Something we only began to notice when arriving at the location. The expedition leader, Dr. Andres Cortés, a respected man in his field, received us with unusual caution. There was a weight to his words, as if he knew we were about to enter dangerous territory. The pyramid holds secrets, he said, and some of them may not be easy to accept. Why would he tell us something like that? What secrets could be so disturbing that even an expert like him would show hesitation? And why did that place feel so strange? Little did we know at that moment that we were about to confront something that would challenge not only our science, but also our understanding of reality. In the first few days, everything went as expected. We explored the outside of the pyramid, reviewed old maps, and began to study the inscriptions, but the feeling of restlessness persisted. Something waited for us in the depths of that pyramid, something that would change our lives forever. Are you ready to find out what we found? The sun was high when we finally positioned ourselves in front of the secret entrance to the pyramid. Hidden beneath twisted roots and thick vegetation, the passage seemed to have been forgotten by time. Dr. Cortés, with a serious expression, guided us there. He had briefly mentioned the difficulties of accessing the chamber, but nothing prepared us for what we would find. The feeling that something dark awaited us grew with each step. As soon as we removed the stones that sealed the entrance, a gust of cold air hit us. The smell was damp, thick, as if we were about to enter an ancient tomb that had remained sealed for millennia. Sienna, always meticulous, was the first to examine the writings on the walls of the entrance. His gaze, usually calm and curious, soon turned into a mix of confusion and apprehension. "That doesn't make sense," she muttered, running her fingers over the inscription. "These symbols are unlike anything we've seen before in other Mayan ruins." I got closer, trying to understand what was troubling her so much. The pattern of the inscriptions looked familiar, but there was something inherently strange about them. The figures carved into the rocks did not represent the traditional Mayan gods that we were used to seeing. Instead, they were distorted shapes, almost humanoid, but elongated and with disproportionately large eyes. It was as if the art itself had been influenced by something beyond this world. As we continued to advance, Jack, the team's geologist, found something peculiar on one of the interior walls. There were small fragments of metal embedded in the stone, as if a primitive technology, or one that was too advanced for the period, had been integrated into the construction of the pyramid. "This shouldn't be here," he said, his voice revealing a mix of fascination and discomfort. "These materials are anomalous. They do not belong to this time." The mystery began to take shape. With each new find, the feeling that we were unveiling something that should never have been found grew. Sienna continued to be absorbed in the inscription, and I noticed her discomfort increasing. There was something deeply disturbing about the symbol, as if the Mayans had been desperately trying to warn of something far beyond our understanding. Our initial enthusiasm was quickly replaced by a growing sense of fear. Something in that pyramid was watching us. And as we progressed, this feeling intensified, as if we were being drawn into the heart of a secret that was not meant to be revealed. That evening, after an exhausting day of excavation, we gathered at camp to discuss the findings. We were isolated, surrounded by the dense forest that surrounded Chichen Itza. The moon shone with an almost supernatural intensity, casting long, unsettling shadows across the land. As we analyzed the notes, The tension was palpable. Sienna, usually so sure of her interpretation, seemed more thoughtful than ever. "These inscriptions," she began hesitantly, "they are not just a historical description. They are a warning. We are not dealing with a simple ancient civilization. There is something wrong here." What exactly did she mean? I knew her well enough to know that she wasn't someone prone to superstition or jumping to conclusions. But the evidence was in front of those inscriptions, those distorted humanoid shapes, the inexplicable technology we began to encounter. Something told us there was much more beneath the surface than we could have imagined. Dr. Cortez, sitting in silence for a long time, finally spoke. "During the preliminary excavations, there were other incidents," he said in a low voice, almost as if he didn't want to be heard by others. "Some local workers refused to continue. They said they had seen shadows moving on the walls of the chamber. I thought it was superstition. Until today." Jack, who until then maintained a more carefree air, finally revealed an uneasiness. "You mean there's something more here? Something we can't explain with science?" The silence that followed was deafening. I knew that was the question we were all avoiding, but it was also impossible to ignore the facts. As the night progressed, I decided to review old maps of the pyramid. There were a lot of details that didn't make sense. Areas that seemed intentionally sealed off, as if the builders themselves had tried to prevent access to specific parts of the structure. But why? The mystery only fueled our curiosity. The fear was real, but the need to understand the unknown was stronger. Sienna continued to examine her texts, determined to uncover what the ancient Mayans tried to warn about. Dr. Cortez, more cautious now, suggested that we should be more careful. "Curiosity can lead us to great discoveries," he said, "but it can also lead us to ruin." That phrase echoed in my mind. We were about to cross an invisible threshold, not knowing that the price for unlocking these secrets would be much higher than we were willing to pay. The next morning we were all restless, but the determination to continue overcame any hesitation. The pyramid of Kukulkan stood imposingly before us, like a silent sentinel guarding the secrets we had only begun to touch. Dr. Cortez, who seemed more reserved since the previous night's revelations, guided us to an area that workers had avoided for generations, a barely visible entrance hidden beneath vegetation and the roots of ancient trees. It was hard to believe that this passage had gone unnoticed for so long, as if the pyramid itself were hiding the path. We carefully removed the debris, and upon entering we were immediately overcome by denser, colder, moisture-laden air. The light from the lanterns revealed an ancient staircase that spiraled downward, taking us to a depth none of us expected. The walls, engraved with inscriptions that seemed increasingly complex and enigmatic, were dotted with signs that suggested a different script than the Mayans traditionally used. Sienna, although intrigued, began to show signs of uneasiness. "This is not what we expected," she said in a low voice. "These symbols, they're ancient, but they can't be entirely Mayan. There's something more here." The silence was heavy as we descended. Each step echoed through the depths of that structure, as if we were entering a place not meant to be set foot again. When we finally reached the bottom, what we found took our breath away. Before us, a vast underground chamber revealed itself, with a dark majesty that seemed to pulse with an unknown energy. The walls were covered in inscriptions in languages that even Sienna could not fully decipher, and the center of the room was dominated by a circular structure made up of large stone blocks arranged like an altar. On the ground around it, there were small stone circles arranged in a way that seemed ritualistic. Sienna and I approached the altar, and it was she who broke the silence, reading an inscription on the central stone. "Let no one cross this threshold, for he who sleeps beyond knows no mercy," she read in a low but clear voice. "The gods are not what they seem, and their fury consumes the flesh and soul. Those who awaken their wrath will suffer eternally in the cycle of sacrifice." The weight of those words hit us like a blow. We felt like we were on forbidden ground, and the atmosphere around us felt alive, pulsing in a way we couldn't explain. Jack, always the first to act, began investigating the altar, looking for a way to open what appeared to be an additional chamber beneath us. His enthusiasm contrasted with the gloomy atmosphere that surrounded the place, and Dr. Cortez, who had remained silent until then, watched with visible tension in his eyes. "Carefully, Jack," Cortez warned. "There are things here that are best left alone." But it was too late. The door to the unknown had already been ajar. As Jack continued to examine the altar, the air in the chamber seemed to become thicker, colder, as if an invisible presence was beginning to surround us. I felt the weight of the atmosphere, as if something was watching us from the shadow, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Sienna, who until then had been mesmerized by the inscriptions, suddenly moved away, her eyes fixed on something further, in the depths of the room. "Aaron, come and see this," she murmured, her voice filled with disbelief. I walked towards him, and what I saw made my heart skip a beat. It was a room within the chamber, a secondary area almost camouflaged by shadows. The walls of this new area were not only covered in inscription, but also strange metallic devices, embedded in the stones in a way that defied everything we knew about Mayan engineering. Small circuits glowed with a dim light, as if they were still operating after millennia of neglect. Jack joined us, his gaze fixed on the devices. "That doesn't make sense," he said, his voice filled with a combination of fascination and fear. "We're talking about a civilization that flourished over 1,000 years ago. This seems more advanced than anything we know today." Sienna, always analytical, tried to find an explanation, but the facts simply didn't fit together. The devices on the walls, although deteriorated by time, clearly did not belong to the human technology of the time, or perhaps of any time. "They came from somewhere," she muttered, almost to herself. "These gods weren't human. They weren't just myth." As we explored deeper, Jack found a panel that appeared to be some sort of holographic map. Upon activating, a three-dimensional projection of the Earth appeared before us, connected to other points in space, like routes that connected planets and dimensions. It was a vision that challenged all our conceptions of reality. Sienna was pale. "The Mayans didn't build this," she stated, her voice now firm but frightened. "These gods, they arrived here from other worlds. What if this place isn't just a tomb, but a portal? An entry point to something much greater?" We all felt the gravity of that revelation. We weren't just digging up the past. We were on the verge of discovering something that could change humans' understanding of their own existence. The technology in front of us was out of this world, and the stories we thought were myths seemed so much more real than any of us could bear. And as we took this in, something in the air changed. A low hum began to emanate from the walls, as if that ancient technology was awakening from its centuries-old slumber. We were touching something we shouldn't have touched, and the consequences were already in motion. After unintentionally activating the holographic map and awakening that strange technology, the atmosphere in the chamber changed drastically. The metallic hum that echoed through the walls seemed to gain intensity, ringing in our ears and racing our hearts. The chamber, which had previously been plunged into an almost reverent silence, now pulsed with an almost palpable energy, as if we were being watched by invisible eyes. It was impossible to deny the feeling of imminent danger. "We need to get out of here," said Dr. Cortez, his voice tense. He was sweating, his gaze now dominated by a mixture of fear and urgency. "We don't know what else could be triggered. We must retreat and reevaluate what we found." Sienna, although reluctant, nodded. She knew that what we had discovered was not something to be taken lightly. Jack himself, who normally had a more relaxed and adventurous stance, was visibly worried. As we began to move toward the exit, a sudden violent noise echoed through the chamber. A sharp crack followed by a thud. We looked back and saw that part of the roof had collapsed. Jack was the first to run over to check, but as he approached the rubble, he staggered and fell to the ground. His leg was trapped under the heavy stones that fell from the ceiling. "Help!" he shouted, his voice filled with pain and despair. We ran to him, trying to move the stones to free him, but his condition was serious. His leg was severely injured. Blood was already beginning to stain the floor. As we struggled to pull Jack out of the rubble, he began babbling something incomprehensible. His eyes were wide, fixed on the shadows that danced on the walls of the chamber, as if he was seeing something we couldn't see. There's something here. A shadow, watching me." His voice was shaky, his words filled with dread. I tried to calm him, believing that the trauma and pain were clouding his judgment. But deep down, we all knew he wasn't delusional. Since we had entered that place, a feeling of presence, of something more ancient and obscure than we could understand, had surrounded us. The shadows that previously seemed harmless now seemed to have a life of their own, moving as if they were a part of the place itself, silently watching. We managed to free Jack, but he was seriously injured. We decided it would be best to take him back to camp for medical care. Dr. Cortez, visibly worried, began to move more quick, pressing us to get out of that place. But the worst was yet to come, and we knew it wouldn't be so easy to escape what we had awakened to. Back at camp, Jack's condition only worsened. Although we managed to stabilize his leg, he was increasingly feverish and agitated, repeating insistently about the shadows he had seen in the chamber. His voice, broken with pain, told us about a dark figure, something he swore he saw moving through the walls, like an observant presence. But what was that? Hallucinations of a traumatized mind? Or was there something more in those shadows? Dr. Cortez, now completely overcome by urgency, decided that we needed outside help. "We have to communicate this to the Institute and bring in more experts to assess the situation," he said, picking up the radio to try to make contact. However, what happened next chilled us to the bone. The radio, which until that moment was working perfectly, was completely silent. No signal, no response. It was as if we had been isolated from the entire world. We repeatedly tried to establish contact, but the only thing we heard was the oppressive silence of radio static. "That's impossible," Cortez muttered, adjusting the device several times, trying to tune different frequencies, but to no avail. "We're in a no-interference zone. It shouldn't be happening." That feeling of isolation hit us like a ton of rocks. The archaeological camp was isolated enough to begin with, but now, with communications cut off, the idea that we were alone with the unknown began to become unbearable. The wind was blowing strong that afternoon, bringing with it the feeling that something was approaching, something that could not be stopped or understood with simple, rational explanation. Sienna, normally logical and balanced, began to show signs of restlessness. What if we're not the first to lose contact here? What if this has happened before? The question hung in the air, heavy, while the silence around us seemed to intensify the word. Cortez told us that, in fact, other groups that had attempted to explore deeper parts of the pyramid had reported strange incidents, but that until then they had been dismissed as local superstition. As night fell, the camp became increasingly tense. Jack, now feverish and delirious, mumbled incoherent, talking about eyes in the walls and figures waiting in the shadows. I looked at Sienna and saw fear in her eyes, something I rarely saw, and we knew things were getting out of control. That radio silence was a harbinger of something bigger. We were trapped, disconnected from the outside world, and even worse, we were at the mercy of forces we were barely beginning to understand. As the hours dragged on that unsettling night, Jack's condition worsened with each passing moment. His fever seemed to have an origin we couldn't explain, and the disjointed words he muttered over the shadows and figures watching him began to bother us even more. But it wasn't just Jack that worried us. Sienna, who until then had remained calm and determined to unravel the mystery, began to behave strangely. She moved away from the group and remained silent, analyzing the inscriptions she had brought from the chamber as if she were in a kind of trance. The next dawn I noticed something alarming. Sienna's hands were stained with a dark, almost black substance that seemed to have soaked into her skin overnight. "Sienna, what is this?" I asked, trying to control my panic. She looked at her own hands, confused and dazed. I don't know," he replied, his voice shaky as he tried to rub off the substance with a damp cloth, but it didn't come out. It was as if that substance had fused with the skin, becoming part of it. Dr. Cortez, now more worried than ever, approached to examine Sienna. He tried to analyze the liquid with his equipment, but did not get clear answers. "This isn't natural," he said, his face pale with worry. "I've never seen anything like it. It could be something related to the artifacts in the chamber, something old, perhaps contaminated." Contaminated, the word echoed in my mind. We began to discuss the possibility that the substance was linked to the artifacts we had discovered, something Sienna had touched while deciphering the inscriptions or manipulating the objects in the chamber. So what was that? An ancient curse? Some kind of alien chemical we didn't understand? Sienna, who was usually the most logical of all of us, began to manifest stranger symptoms. She reported feelings of weakness and dizziness, and her eyes, once so focused and shrewd, now seemed distant, as if they were observing something none of us could see. "There's something inside me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something is trying to take control." Those words froze us all. Jack was already on the verge of death due to his collapse, and now Sienna seemed to be succumbing to an invisible, relentless force. It was as if we were dealing with something supernatural, something that had remained hidden for millennia and was now beginning to emerge through us. Panic began to take over the camp. What had we freed? We were just at the beginning of something much bigger and much more dangerous. As Sienna's condition worsened, I began frantically rereading the notes we had collected from the chamber. The writings on the walls that initially intrigued us now seemed to contain answers, or at least warning. One phrase in particular stood out: "The gods demand blood, or their wrath will be unleashed upon the earth." Those words echoed in my mind as I tried to make sense of what was happening to Sienna. It was then that Dr. Cortez brought to light a dark hypothesis. "What if these gods aren't just myths?" he asked, his voice heavy with gravity. "What if the contamination Sienna is experiencing is a sign that something has been awakened? Something that requires sacrifice?" The idea of a sacrificial ritual, something so archaic and primitive, seemed impossible to accept in the modern era, but the evidence before us was hard to ignore. Sienna was deteriorating rapidly, and Jack, still feverish and delirious, repeatedly mentioned the need for blood to placate the god. The inscriptions we had found spoke of human sacrifice, rituals done to ensure peace between the shifting gods and the ancient Maya. But those stories were just legends, right? As we discussed the possibility, something in Sienna's behavior changed. She began speaking in languages we didn't understand, guttural and incomprehensible words, while her body writhed in pain. The situation was becoming untenable. Cortez, with desperate eyes, suggested the unthinkable. Maybe the ritual needs to be completed," he murmured. "The texts speak of 2 sacrifices to appease the god. If we don't do something, we could lose Sienna forever." The room was completely silent. The suggestion of human sacrifice was something none of us could conceive of, but as Sienna's words became darker, we realized we weren't just dealing with physical contamination. Something spiritual, or alien, was taking control of her. And if we didn't act, we would lose more than just a colleague's life. With our eyes fixed on the altar described in the inscriptions, we began to realize that the only way to save Sienna and prevent something much worse from happening was to fulfill what the ancient inscriptions asked. But how could we justify sacrificing human lives? And who would be the second victim? The answers were unclear, but the looming decision would put us all on a path of no return. The atmosphere in the camp was filled with almost unbearable tension. The silence between us was broken only by the occasional sound of Sienna, mumbling incomprehensible words and writhing in visceral pain. The idea of human sacrifice, something that, until a few days ago, seemed absurdly distant from our reality, now became an increasingly palpable possibility. There was a heaviness in the air, an ominous urgency, as if time was running out quickly, and the environment itself was conspiring against it. Sergeant Cortez, normally methodical and rational, now seemed like a man pressed to the limits of his conviction. "The inscriptions are clear," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "2 sacrifices must be offered to appease the wrath of the gods. Or whatever that is." We looked at each other, each trying to assimilate what was being suggested, trying to avoid the inevitable conclusion that, to save Sienna, someone would have to die. Jack, still weak and feverish, was surprisingly the first to speak out. "If I have to, I'll do it," he said, his voice hoarse with pain. "If it saves Sienna, then so be it, but who will be second?" That question hung over us like a storm cloud. The sacrifice of 1 life was already unimaginable, but 2, who would be the next victim? As we discussed the unthinkable, the shadows around us seemed to intensify, as if an invisible force was surrounding it, waiting for us to make a decision. It was as if the chamber itself, the place itself, was demanding the sacrifice. Jack, with strength that surprised everyone, stood up, still limping from his injured leg, and walked to the makeshift altar we had built from the inscription. "Let's get this over with," he said, more determined than ever. Cortez tried to argue, but we knew there was no more time for hesitation. With a small pocket knife, Jack made a deep cut in his hand and let the blood drip onto the cold stones of the altar. The air in the chamber seemed to change immediately. A dense, oppressive energy took over the space, as if the pyramid was reacting to the sacrifice, accepting it as part of an ancient, dark ritual. But 1 life was not enough. We all knew that. The inscription was clear. 2 sacrifices were necessary. What would we do now? Jack's gaze, who had already accepted his fate, turned to us. "Who will be next?" he asked, voice almost blanked by pain. The silence that followed that question was unbearable, and the pressure of deciding who would be the next victim pushed us into an abyss of despair from which there was no return. The silence that followed Jack's sacrifice was crushing. The shadows around us seemed to move more actively, like predators circling their prey, waiting for the next act that would complete the ritual. The altar, now stained with blood, seemed to vibrate with a supernatural energy, as if the entire place was waiting for the outcome of what had begun. We knew that yet another sacrifice was necessary, and every second that passed seemed to increase the weight of that truth on our shoulders. Cortez walked away, visibly disturbed. He knew he was the leader of the expedition, responsible for all of us, but the responsibility of choosing the second victim was a burden no human being should bear. What was left for us was to face the unthinkable, save Sienna, whatever the cost, or retreat, accepting that her fate was sealed. Sienna, now almost unrecognizable, continued to mumble words in a language no one understood. Her eyes, once full of intelligence, were now lost in a dark void, as if she were being consumed by a force that did not belong to Earth. Her arms flailed, her fingers twisted as if she were fighting an invisible presence that was eating her from the inside out. I felt panic rising inside, an internal battle between reason and despair. Could we really move forward with this? Could we allow another life to be taken to complete a ritual whose meaning we barely understood? Jack, in his pain and fever, had made his choice. But who would be second? It was then, in a moment of terrifying clarity, that I realized the decision was up to me. Something inside me, perhaps fear, perhaps guilt, pushed me to act. I knew that if someone didn't make a decision soon, whatever was waiting in those shadows would come to us anyway, and then none of us would survive. Cortez noticed my hesitation and tried to stop me. "Aaron, don't do this. We can't go down this path," he exclaimed, grabbing my arm. But the horror of the situation had already consumed any logic or rationality I might have left in me, and it was at that moment, when we were all on the verge of collapse, that something unexpected happened. The air in the chamber suddenly turned cold, and an invisible but undeniably real presence filled the space. A tall, thin figure made up of shadows and darkness began to materialize in the center of the room, hovering over the altar. His voice did not come through the ears, but resounded directly in our minds, clear as the touch of a sharp blade. "One more life," said the figure, its voice reverberating through our consciousness, filling us with a sense of absolute dread. 2 lives for 1. The decision was there in front of us, cold and implacable. Sacrifice would be required one way or another. I looked at Sienna, now on the verge of death, and then at my companion, and felt the crushing weight of the choice I would have to make. At that moment, I knew there was no escape. Someone would have to pay the ultimate price. The presence of that figure of shadows and darkness, hovering over the altar, brought with it a truth that was increasingly inescapable. We were trapped in an ancient and relentless cycle. Sacrifice was not just a momentary requirement. It was part of something much bigger, something that transcended time and space. Those gods that the Mayans revered or feared had not disappeared. They were there, waiting for the fulfillment of a pact that had been sealed millennia ago. 1 more life, repeated the figure, his voice sounding like the echo of eternity itself. Its distorted form seemed to merge with the darkness of the chamber, making it impossible to distinguish where the shadow ended and the creature began. Those words were not just a demand, but a sentence. We knew there was no longer any way to escape. While fear dominated us all, Sienna, between moans and whispers, began to speak, but this time, it was not in the guttural and incomprehensible language that we heard before. His voice, although weak, was clear. "It's the cycle," she murmured, her eyes wide as if she had finally understood the truth behind the text she had studied. "It's a cycle that never ends. It needs blood to continue." Sienna's words hit us like a shock. What she was saying was clear. The sacrificial cycle of the ancient Maya was not just a ritual to appease their gods. It was a pact to keep these shapeshifters asleep, away from our reality. And now somehow, we had reactivated this cycle. We were at the center of a game that we didn't fully understand, but which demanded a terrible price. Dr. Cortez, normally the most skeptical among us, looked at the shadows around him and finally broke the silence. "Does this mean that this sacrifice is not just to save Sienna, but to ensure that these things don't return to our world?" He was trying to process the horror of the situation, just like the rest of us. The idea that our destinies were intertwined with forces beyond human understanding was almost impossible to accept. But at the same time, the evidence was there, clear as the blood on the altar. Sacrifice was not just a matter of life and death. It was a matter of avoiding something much bigger and more destructive. And the more we tried to avoid this truth, the more it became inevitable. The cycle demanded to be completed, and the presence of shadows around us made it clear that we had no other choice. It was no longer just about saving Sienna, but about stopping something much darker from breaking free from its ancient prison. The decision had been made, even if it had not been expressed in words. The cycle demanded a second life, and Jack's sacrifice, however terrible it was not enough to appease the fury of those beings who lived in the shadow. With a lump in our throat and heavy hearts, we all knew it was only a matter of time before the second sacrifice was made. But who would be the victim? And would we be willing to live with the guilt that would come with that choice? But then something unexpected happened. Just as we were preparing to make this final decision, the air in the chamber began to vibrate strangely. The shadows, which had previously moved slowly, now seemed to move frantically, as if they had sensed a change in the environment. The very ground beneath our feet seemed to pulse, as if it were about to give way. "We have to get out of here!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the chamber. Without thinking twice, we ran towards the exit. Sienna in Cortez's arms, still in a state of profound weakness. The very structure of the pyramid seemed to be crumbling around us, as if the place was rebelling against our presence. The sound of rocks clashing and cracks echoing through the walls followed us, and the fear of being buried alive drove us to keep running, despite our exhaustion. When we finally emerged to the surf, panting and covered in dust, the sight of the open sky had never been so comforting. The feeling of being out of that cursed place again brought immediate, albeit temporary, relief. However, the weight of what we had left behind still hung over us. We were safe for now, but we knew something much bigger had been released. At camp, we tried to re-establish contact with the outside world, but communications were still cut off. Dr. Cortez, although relieved to have escaped with his life, was visibly shaken. This isn't over," he murmured, looking at Sienna, who now seemed to be starting to regain some of her lucidity. Sienna, with a distant look, nodded in agreement. "No," she said softly, "the cycle has not yet been completed." His words hit us like a bitter revelation. We had fled the chamber, but the ritual had not been completed. The pyramid of Kukulkan, the cycle of sacrifices, the shadows, all of this still hung over us like an invisible threat. The feeling of being in the real world again was an illusion, as the forces we had awakened were still present, watching us, waiting for the right moment to demand what was due to them. And although we were physically out of the chamber, the truth was that we would never be truly free. After we emerged from the chamber, a strange feeling of relief mixed with terror overcame us. For a moment, we believed that, at least temporarily, we were safe. But we knew that the escape was just an illusion, a brief pause in something that wasn't yet over. The forces we unleashed in the pyramid, the incomplete cycle, the shadows that still lurked in the depths of Chichen Itza, all of these would pursue us beyond the walls of the chamber. Sienna, who until then seemed to be starting to recover, soon showed signs that the danger was far from over. His movements, initially hesitant and confused, became abrupt and violent. She, who had always been so calm and logical, was now restless, her eyes darting from side to side as if she were observing something invisible to us all. "They're here," he murmured repeatedly, his voice now cold and distant. "They won't stop." Cortez and I exchanged worried looks. Something was happening to Sienna. Something that was beyond any rational explanation we could offer. She was changing, being consumed by an invisible presence. And the most terrifying thing was that we knew that this was not the result of a hallucination or a mere side effect of the chamber. That black substance that had fused to her skin, that erratic behavior and disjointed words, Everything pointed to the fact that the changing gods we discovered in the chamber were taking control of Sienna. One night, as I was reviewing my notes, Sienna approached, but something about her was different. His eyes, once full of life, now seemed empty, almost predatory. "You brought them here," she said, her voice low and threatening. "You paved the way." His words echoed in my mind like a terrible omen. She was no longer the Sienna I knew. With each sentence she uttered, it was clear that something or someone was communicating through her. "They will be back, Aaron," she whispered, approaching me with a disturbing calm. "The cycle has not been broken. It is just beginning." And with those words, I knew we were in grave danger. Sienna was no longer Sienna. She was possessed by something much older and more powerful, something that used her body as a conduit, a puppet, to communicate its intention. The idea that the cycle of sacrifice was not complete, that the entities we discovered had found a way to cross the barrier between their world and ours, hit me with full force. What began as an archaeological exploration was now turning into an endless nightmare. Sienna's possession was proof that we hadn't escaped. Instead, we had brought evil with us, and it was spreading. The following days were a mixture of fear and hopelessness. Sienna was increasingly distant, and I knew that somehow the shifting gods had taken complete control over her. Cortez, in denial, tried to find a scientific explanation for what was happening. But deep down, we knew we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. There were forces at play that science could not explain, entities that operated on a different plane than ours. Meanwhile, the camp was enveloped in an atmosphere of unbearable oppression. It seemed as if the shadows that once inhabited the chamber had begun to infiltrate every aspect of our reality. During the night, I could swear I saw dark, distorted shapes moving at the edges of my vision, and every whisper of the wind brought a feeling that we were being watched. Local workers, already superstitious, began to abandon the camp, muttering about old spirits and curses that had been released. That's when the last piece of the puzzle revealed itself. A letter I found at camp. It was an ancient manuscript which described the cycle of sacrifices in much more detail than the inscriptions we had seen. According to the text, the cycle not only required 2 sacrifices to placate the god, but also involved the possession of the souls of those who had been chosen. In other words, once someone was marked by the changing god, as Sienna clearly had been, there was no escape. Sienna, now almost unrecognizable, confronted me again. "You called them, Aaron. You started the cycle. Now they are here. And they won't stop until the cycle is complete." Her words were cold, almost mechanical, as if she were merely a vessel for something much more sinister. I felt the deep terror of being trapped in something that could not be stopped. That night, while everyone was sleeping, I started to hear whispers. It wasn't just Sienna's words. There were voices, many voices, speaking in an ancient and unintelligible language. I knew that meant only one thing. The cycle was starting over again. And this time he would demand more than physical sacrifice. He would demand our soul. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. We had crossed a line that should never have been touched. The changing gods had returned. And now they would not rest until the cycle was complete. The shadows that surrounded us were not just manifestations of fear. They were a reality that was now part of our world. I knew at that moment that the cycle would never end. We were trapped in an eternal game, where sacrifices would always be demanded, and those who were marked by the gods would never escape. As we reflect on this terrifying story, we are confronted with the impact of unearthing secrets that should have remained forgotten. What began as an archaeological expedition in search of historical knowledge quickly turned into a supernatural night, where forces beyond our understanding were unleashed. But the real question that remains is, how far would we be willing to go in the name of science and discovery? Would we be able to face the dark consequences that come with forbidden knowledge? Are there ancient secrets in the world that should remain buried? I'd like to know what you think. How far would you go to unravel a mystery? If you like this story and want to follow more stories as intense and exciting as this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. This way you'll be the first to know when new stories are posted. Don't miss our next adventures full of mystery, suspense, and terror.